Are starting to join, so welcome. Thanks for being here.
All right, YouTube's live.
Great. Thanks, Ben. All right, we'll get started in about 2 minutes. We are just about to kick off the September 30th Resource Planning Advisory Group meeting. So thanks so much for being here. And if you're joining us from YouTube Live, just know we are recording today's meeting. So this will be a part of a recording that's then posted on Puget Sound Energy's website. And I'll repeat that once we officially get started, but we will hold for another 2 minutes, let people enter the space, and then kick us off. Hey, well, it is 1 o'clock and I see lots of folks coming into this space. So thank you so much for being here. Yeah, and you can leave it on this slide for now. Thank you so much. I did want to remind folks that are joining us live stream or just coming into the space now, we are recording today's meeting. So just know that, and will be posted on the Puget Sound Energy's website. So with that, I'll go ahead and welcome you all. So good afternoon. I'm Annie Kilberg-Smith. I'm going to be facilitating today's Puget Sound Energy Resource Planning Advisory Group meeting. Been facilitating this group for a while, so excited to see a couple new faces as alternates and all of the reoccurring people that keep coming to these meetings today. So thanks for being here and taking time out of your day. I know it's a big chunk of time for all of you. I'm just wanting to also let you know for presenters, I'm going to go ahead and be reading questions that get posted in the chat out loud. So no need to do that. I will make sure that I'm doing that. That's just so people can hear the questions that maybe don't see them in the chat or only joining via phone. And just a reminder, this meeting is, it is open to the public. So people get to attend and observe either from the live stream or as an attendee. Also, another note, we were going to just request that if RPAG members are comfortable, if you want to keep your cameras on today, we would just love to highly encourage that. We've heard from a few of the folks on the advisory group that maybe it would be nice to get to know each other a little bit better, and being able to see each other's faces is kind of a starting point to be able to do that. So if you're comfortable and you're not eating lunch or not driving, of course, we want you to be safe. Please feel free to turn on your camera when you would like, and go in and out of the space visually. That just helps us all get to know each other's faces a little bit better. Okay, next slide. So a few quick facilitator requests to keep things running smooth today. We want to just make sure that we keep the conversation constructive and courteous to all folks. So I'll be here to help guide us through each part of the agenda and make sure that we're doing that. If you are using any acronyms or technical terms, please try to give a quick explanation so that people can follow along that may not be as familiar with those terms. And if something's outside of the scope of today's discussion, please feel free to drop it in the feedback form or email PSE, and we'll put that form link and the PSE email address in the chat for all of you. Of course, PSE wants to hear from you, so if you have something else you'd like to share, please do. And just a quick heads up on the public comment, we are going to have that after PSE's presentations today and all the questions and answers. I know this is a 3-hour meeting, so we will make sure to pause and create the space for that towards the end. And we're also going to ask the speakers if they'd like to come on camera. And so we will make sure to give you the instructions on how to do that when we get to that point. Okay. And then in terms of reminders on Zoom controls, is there a Zoom slide next? Nope, that's okay. But I did want to give a few reminders on Zoom controls. So please go ahead and use your raise hand on the reactions bar to raise your hand if needed. And you'll see there's a heart next to the react, but you can just click on that and then press raise hand. So don't be afraid that you're going to send a heart emoji onto the meeting that is there, but it won't automatically do that. You do have to click on it. And then wanted to get you aware that the transcription function is working fine today, as well as the translation. So if you need it translated, captions in English, they're there, or if you'd like to have them into another language, you can do that as well. And if you need help with that, just let us know in the chat, and me or Ben can help you get that resolved. And then a quick reminder about the chat function. So when you go into the chat box, you'll want to make sure that there's a to box and there's a blue rectangle. Make sure it drops down to hosts and panelists, to everyone, so that everyone that is attending in the observation role can see the chat if you're comfortable doing that. When you have it to hosts and panelists, it only goes to the RPAG members. And so it's always nice for the public to also see what's being shared in the chat. Okay, so as for our safety moment today, September is National Preparedness Month, and it is important to create a family emergency plan and build an emergency kit. Just knowing your risks based on where you live is always good. So we want to just encourage you to do that and get involved with your community on doing that. And if you need more information on how to create those plans or kits, please go ahead and go to ready.gov, and we can drop that in the chat as well. Next slide. So we've got a great lineup of speakers today. So you're going to be hearing from several folks from Puget Sound Energy. We have Kara Durbin, Director of Clean Energy Strategy, Jennifer Colson, Manager of Operations and Gas Analysis. We have Ray Outlaw, Manager of Communication Initiatives, Elizabeth Hosner, Manager from Resource Planning and Analysis. And then we have a E3 consultant, a Senior Managing Consultant, Michaela Levine, who's going to be presenting as well. So thank you all so much for being here. And in addition to those speakers, we've got lots of other Puget Sound Energy colleagues on the line, as well as the resource advisory members. So thank you for being here. And I wanted to just ask if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself in the chat. Looks like we do have a few newer folks, and it's always good to just get to know you again. So if you don't mind putting your name, who you represent, and maybe what you're looking for to get out of today's agenda, that would be great to hear. And we'd love to see that information just waterfall in as we continue through some of the other slides. Okay, next slide. All right, we've got a full agenda. As always, once we get through this housekeeping and welcome portion, we're going to be following that with the integrated system plan development updates from the PSE team. And then we're going to be hearing about the clean energy customer survey results and review some key findings from the team as well. We'll do a quick break before we go into the resource adequacy results. And then, of course, leave time for brief next steps and, of course, public comment opportunity for folks that would like to do that today. Any questions on the agenda? And thanks so much for introducing yourselves in the chat. Welcome, all of you. Lauren, John, Froylan, Callie, Ezra, Quinn, nice to have you all here. Alexis, great. Okay, then let's keep going. Feel free to keep introducing yourself in the chat. Love to see those updates. We can go to the next slide. All right, so we've got some meeting objectives today. So first and foremost, PSE is going to be providing some ISP integrated system plan development updates. So sharing progress, some key milestones in preparing that integrated system plan and outline upcoming steps in the planning process. We're also going to be covering, providing that overview of the clean energy survey results. So summarizing some key findings from the recent survey and highlighting customer perspectives on clean energy transition. And then the last topic, presenting the latest analysis of whether PSE's resource can be met within the demand through 2027. So those are the topics and the objectives that we're going to be covering today. And what we'd like to see from you, if you want to go to the next slide, we really value the input that we hear from you. So really we want to just, please encourage you to listen for, key updates and note anything that you'd like clarified. This is really a big informational session with lots of questions and lots of time for questions and answers. So please share your questions if something's unclear, or if you need more background to fully understand the material, that's completely understandable. This is all very technical information. Let us know if there's some facts or assumptions or context that you think should be explained, that you think would be helpful for you to further understand the discussion and be able to participate more fully. And then if you have any confusion or information gaps, please just flag them, and so we can help you get aligned. And then, of course, I'll be helping if there's any risks or tensions that come up or misalignment, and I'll be helping facilitate the conversation as needed. But really, we're just hoping to have your input help and hear you have the information shared today, so that the input that you provide as part of this planning process can be given in a way that's helpful to PSE. Okay, any questions about the agenda today? Okay, next slide then. Okay, so with that, I'll go ahead and hand over the first topic on the integrated system plan development updates over to Jennifer Coulson and Kara Durbin. So you two can take it from here.
Great, thanks, Annie. Next slide. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Coulson. I'm going to kick us off here, and I'm going to hand it to Kara in a moment. So we wanted to take some time to just update the 27 ISP schedule. It had brought to our attention that we hadn't updated this slide since we had extended the filing date of the first ISP to April 1st of 27 due to the delay in the rulemaking process. So we wanted to take a moment and acknowledge that. So we've updated this figure for you. You can see that we're filing our first ISP April 1st of 27. A few other notable updates here as we walk through this slide. You'll notice that we are over in Q3 of 25. There's been a lot of work going on and still going on as we're finalizing those inputs for the reference case. There has been a few delays. You'll notice if you compare this to the prior slide, we expanded the CPA update and load scenarios box just a little bit. We've had some delays in finalizing those load scenarios, and that was generally just due to some data challenges, and then also just the finalization of the rules and ensuring that we're aligning all those different components. So we're still working through all those things. That conversation is slated for November for the RPAG, so I know everyone's really excited to hear about those. The other real exciting update is that the HB 1589 rules have been finalized by the Commission on Friday. So those have been posted, and you can check those out if you're interested. We don't really have much to say at this point. We're still digesting them, as many of you will be as well. And then I think that's kind of the updates. We're planning to provide a draft portfolio towards the end of Q3 and 26, hopefully, and a draft, just publish something to our website regarding the draft of the ISP in January of 27. So that is what I was going to share on this slide. I see some questions in the chat. Do you want me to take a moment, Annie?
Yeah, Jennifer, I can read those out loud for you. So we've got one question from Lisa Schwartz. How does the inputs closure date compared to IRP?
Yeah, it's a good question, Lisa. I don't think we've ever really formally, I'm not sure if we formally established a closure date before in an IRP. I think the reason for it this time, and something we aspired to do in the last IRP process, was because we have a strong desire to get draft results out to this group specifically sooner, so that we have more time to sit with the results and iterate if necessary to work together on those portfolios. So that's the intention and reason for highlighting the desire to really make sure we nailed those down early in the process.
Thanks, Jennifer. And then Quinn, I saw you linked the rules in the chat, so thanks for sharing those as well.
Yeah, any other questions?
Well, I would just clarify that you might not have had an official date for IRPs, and it might certainly have varied over the years, but I'm just curious about, I mean, I have this issue with research at the National Laboratory, right? You've got to close down your inputs, right? And to do all the analysis and do all the peer review and and then you're looking back and it's like, wow, like 16 months have elapsed and things have changed, right? So it's in that spirit that I asked the question. So I don't know if folks who are, working on the IRP have any sense of historically or recently, how does that compare to when, they're sort of locking down the inputs for IRP?
Yeah, I don't know if, let me see if.
Maybe Philip could.
Go ahead.
Oh, Jen, sorry to interrupt. I think I saw Philip say.
Oh yeah, Philip or Elizabeth, feel free to chime in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would say, Lisa, I think that it's definitely a longer process, right? An ISP is a longer process, as we've talked about. It's not more nimble, that's for sure. It's more comprehensive, but it's not more nimble. So, I think that it's definitely, we have to lock these things down sooner than we have before. Big picture, I don't think a year, honestly, like in the real world, a year is not, I don't know much more about year 20 in 19 than I did in, or I'm sorry, in year 1 than I knew in year 2. You know what I mean? So I think there's to me, there's a lot of times there's a little bit of false sense of precision with knowing, we know, like I'll know the end point because I exactly know the starting point, and I don't know that's true. But in any case, it definitely takes, it's longer because we're aligning all of our analytics between supply planning and distribution planning together. So it has to kind of be done. It just takes longer to crunch through it that way. I don't know if that helped.
No, it does. And in terms of the near-term action plan or, its ilk, I was thinking more in the context of
Sure.
the near-term decisions you've got to make.
Yeah, that totally, I buy that.
Thanks for that back and forth. Okay, Jen, I wasn't sure if you were gonna keep going or if we wanted.
Yeah, I have the next slide. So
Okay.
yeah.
Great.
Thank you though. So if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to talk briefly about a feedback memo that is coming your way shortly. As Philip alluded to, an ISP is a longer process, and we're at a point in this first ISP process now where we've really completed a series of meetings on our modeling assumptions. And you see at the bottom what we fondly call our Tetris graphic, that just shows some of the different topics we've taken up over the last several months. You'll be seeing soon a fairly comprehensive memo that we've put together that is attempting to capture the RPAG feedback and public feedback themes that we've heard from this ISP cycle to date, and also just give you a sense of how PSE is currently reflecting on that feedback and planning to incorporate it in the ISP going forward. It also, for those of you that have been with us on this journey for a little longer, it includes relevant feedback we received during the 2025 IRP cycle before 1589 and before we pivoted to the ISP. So for those of you that have been engaging with PSE for a while, we do typically provide a feedback memo like this. We've typically included it though near the end of our process when we file our final IRP or our CEIP, but we really thought that we'd as we wrap up these initial discussions around modeling assumptions, that it just might be helpful for everyone to see how we've captured your feedback and again, how PSE is reflecting on it moving forward. So our ask of you is just to please review the feedback memo when you receive it. Probably we're thinking shortly after this meeting, and make sure that we're capturing your feedback correctly. And if not, just let us know. We'll post it to our clean energy planning website and send it out to RPAG members shortly. We'll have a feedback window like we do typically for meetings. It'll be open until our next RPAG meeting, which I believe is 4 weeks from today. So you'll have some time with it. And we'll remind you of the different ways that you can reach out to us in that feedback window when we get to the end of the slide deck near the end of the meeting, like we always do. So that's just a heads up of that coming your way. And if there aren't any questions, Annie, I think we'll probably transition from here.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kara. Any questions from folks? Okay. Great. Well, then we can go to the next slide. Next one. Okay. Well, Kara, you don't get to sit this part out quite yet.
No, not quite yet. That's great. So I'll kick this off, and Ray Outlaw, my team, is joining as well, and he's the closest to these survey results, and will be walking us through kind of the questions we asked and what we heard. I just wanted to spend a little time at the outset telling you a little bit about why we did this survey. We really saw it as a tool that could help complement sort of what we already are hearing from our customers through our direct engagement efforts. So we have outreach programs. We've talked to you previously about the DER public engagement pilot that we recently completed. There's a lot of ways in which we engage with customers, but we thought that it would be beneficial to do a survey like this so we could really collect and consider data from multiple different customer segments and really try to test some questions around customer preferences. As we embark on this integrated system plan, we really wanted to have a better understanding of those customer opinions and preferences related to clean energy, and really understand some of their perspectives around costs and trade-offs in the clean energy transition. So that's really what we were aiming for. There were a series of questions. I'm gonna hand it over to Ray, who worked directly with our contractor Edelman to conduct the survey. And he'll walk you through some of the highlights from what we asked, and then we're happy to take questions along the way. So over to you, Ray.
Thank you, Kara. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I will walk through, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I'll walk through a series of questions and
Ray,
results.
you are a little bit quiet, on the quiet side.
Okay, let me speak up, or I can switch to headphones if that's...
No, that's much better. Thank you.
Much better. Okay. Thanks for the ping. So I'll go through a series of questions, and if you have questions or thoughts on each one of these results slides, please pause me as we go through them. So as Kara noted, we contracted with our third party Edelman to help develop and field the survey. Some of you might remember in September of 24, we came and met with the RPAG, and we also at the same time, or a separate meeting, but similar time, met with the AG to get your feedback and suggestions for questions. I would say that all of the survey questions were informed by that feedback, but if you see an asterisk in the slide with a question, that's a question that was really sourced from either the AG, the RPAG, or both. The data are statistically significant. We see in the very bottom of the footnote, I think it's 3% and change margin of error for the largest survey segment. But we also wanted to survey a number of different subsegments. So what you see on the right-hand side is the audience name and the sample size for each of those audiences. And we oversampled in some of those audiences to make sure we had statistically significant data, or high confidence margin, if you will, in those survey segments. The surveys were conducted primarily online, although for a couple of audience segments, we had to make phone calls to make sure people completed the number of surveys. And the survey was done sort of blind. So they weren't told that PSE was asking these questions. It was just more generally that utilities in the region are asking these questions. We did offer the survey in multiple languages too, and although we primarily got responses in English, we did get answers or responses in simplified Chinese, Korean, Spanish, and Vietnamese. Next slide, please. So the first question we asked was around how important is the clean energy transition to you? Before we asked this question, we did have some background information. So we defined what is clean energy, really rooted in the definition that is in CETA, Clean Energy Transformation Act. And as you can see here, probably not a huge surprise, support for clean energy really is high across most customer segments, with customers saying it was somewhat or very important, roughly 80% of the time. And it varies across the different segments, but generally strong support for clean energy. Next slide, please. So then we asked folks, so if you had the choice to make changes about your energy, what powers your home or business, what would be most important to you or must-haves in that conversation? And it's not probably, again, a huge surprise, but reliability and cost are the clear priorities here. And this quantitative data really backs up and supports what we repeatedly hear when conducting in-person engagement. I've done it myself in our DER public participation pilot, but also working with our outreach teams. It's really clear when you talk to customers that reliability and cost are of paramount concern. Next slide. Annie, I'm not seeing any comments, but or questions, but just let me know if one comes up.
One comment, but no questions so far. So you're
Okay,
good
great.
to keep going.
So, well, understanding that cost is a key concern, we knew that going into this. We wanted to test some cost questions, and we ended up with a question about willingness to pay for clean energy. So what we did here is we tried to make it as straightforward as possible. So we said, if a customer has a $100 electric bill, would they be willing to pay 5% or $5 more a month every year for 5 years to support clean energy? I recognize this is not, that's not how compound interest works, right? If you were to actually do the math, it wouldn't be nice, perfect $5 increments or $10 increments along the way, but this was a way we could simplify it so customers are really thinking about, okay, well, what would my change be this year and next year and the year after that? And the last part of this is really important. We asked them what they're willing to pay for clean energy specifically. So this is not a question about how much are you willing to let your power bill go up each month, right? Or each year. This was really trying to tease out what's your willingness to pay for clean energy. So on the next slide, we can see those results, please.
Hi, Ray.
Yes, please. Ezra.
This is Ezra Houseman with Public Counsel. On the previous slide, the way it looked at the question said 5% increase per year.
Correct.
Is that so that over 5 years it would be, well, you said not compounding necessarily, but 25% plus over what the bill would otherwise be?
Right.
Okay. Well,
And they were presented a table very much like this, so that we didn't force them to do the math on the fly. They actually had a table as they were moving this slider that you see on the bottom.
I see. Okay. I wonder how many people understood that table. It's a little complicated, but okay. I see. Thanks.
It is. We went around and around on this question. It is not an easy question to ask. It's a very complicated one.
Understood.
So here are the results. And they're quite interesting. One thing we see that over half, almost 60% of customers indicated they're only willing to pay about 5% or less in annual bill increases to meet clean energy requirements. In the abstract, without being asked to consider cost, the majority of customers we saw earlier were really supportive of the clean energy transformation. But as we dive into cost, that enthusiasm seems to be a bit tempered about their willingness to pay. But it also shows there's a subset of customers that are willing to pay significantly more, 10, even 15 or 20% more to meet clean energy requirements. So it's a mixed bag of results. Lauren, I think, has a question.
Yeah, Lauren McCoy with Northwest Energy Coalition. I have some a little bit of concerns about the framing here. I just don't think is super accurate. Like if you're asking customers, how much more are you willing to pay for clean energy? Presumably they're thinking that the alternative is dirty energy. And I guess I'm just a little bit, that seems more like the kind of question that you would ask if you were asking customers to sign up for like 100% clean voluntary program, right? Like what is the kind of marginal amount that you would be willing to pay more than what you would otherwise pay? But that's not what we're dealing with here. What we're dealing with is this utility is transitioning to clean energy and your costs are going up regardless. So I don't think are they assuming that their bills are going to stay the same if they stay with dirty energy and their bills are only going up if they go to clean energy? I just think it's kind of like a false choice a little bit. I'm 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 just I'm concerned about the way this is being framed because most of the cost increases, at least that I see, that are being projected across the region for utilities are not associated with the clean energy transition. They're associated with other things like wildfire investments, like increasing costs just across the economy, increasing costs across the supply chain. And so I'm just worried that this is sort of presenting customers with a false choice that, hey, you can pay more if you want us to comply with the state's clean energy laws. How much more are you willing to pay for that? Sorry, I'm just feeling a little bit, I don't so far like the way this is being structured.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with Lauren. I mean, the way it seems to be expressed is that that's what's going to cause your energy bills to go up, and nobody wants their energy bills to go up. So, no matter what you said, like, but the implication is that that's the source, which it seems sort of generically pulled out of the air, that this idea that that's what the cost would be.
Yeah.
I understand you're talking about
Thanks.
willingness to pay, but it's just like, it's almost the generic question, are you willing to pay more for your energy? Like, no, I don't want to pay more for my energy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Lauren, Ezra.
Thanks
Oh,
for
I'm
that,
sorry.
Ezra and Lauren. Yeah, Kara, did you want to chime in on this one?
I was just going to thank both Lauren and Ezra for your thoughtful comments. I mean, we really, as Ray alluded to, we really struggled with how to frame this question, really, and just trying to get a sense of, again, that these are requirements, but trying to get a sense of what customers are really willing and able, and happy might be the wrong word, but positioned to say, yes, this is really important to me and I'm willing to pay 15 or 20% more, and which customers were more price sensitive to those costs. But your feedback is thoughtful, and we also don't want to overstate what this question is telling us. So thank you for your feedback. We'll certainly consider that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks,
Thank
Quinn
you.
and Lauren, for the comments in the chat. Thanks. And Froylan. All right. Well, Ray, do you want to kind of keep going with the results and see where that takes us?
Yeah, let's go. Let's keep going because we have another question about cost on the next slide.
Hey, Dennis has his hand up too.
Oh,
Maybe we do that
please,
and then,
Dennis.
sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of weigh in on an observation as I look at this. Really, for the folks who don't want to pay anything, as compared to everybody else, it's 20 or below, which to me is a good sign that you have people willing to pay more at all, and in varying degrees. So to me, this looks like a positive thing, just in being willing to increase price, whether it's clean energy or just the increase in the cost of business. So anyway, just an observation.
Thanks, Dennis. Helpful perspective to hear as well.
Okay, next slide, please. So here we ask folks about their their concerns about being able to pay for their natural gas or electric services in the coming year. And we asked on a scale of not concerned at all, a little concerned, somewhat, or very concerned. And in general, bill concerns are high, with almost 50% across any one of these demographics, give or take, having somewhat or high concern about being able to pay their bills. So this aligns again with the qualitative experience we have in our engagement work that suggests costs are a big concern for customers and perhaps a challenge to our clean energy transformation. Next slide, please. So then we ask folks what concerns, if any, they have regarding the transformation to clean energy. And again, costs are at the top of this list. Cost concerns are at the top of this list, and they show up too in multiple ways, right? So it's not just this higher cost category, but longer term maintenance costs, lack of incentives. I'll note these questions were asked prior to any of the recent federal changes. So, solar incentives, for example, were still in place when these questions were asked. And then some technical challenges like how would this work, what's possible, et cetera. All right, not seeing any questions. We'll keep going.
I guess I just have to chime in again. I'm sorry. But you had just basically told them that your costs are going to go up with clean energy as the framing of the previous question. So it's not surprising that when you then ask, what are your concerns about the transition to clean energy, that cost is going to rise to the top. I mean, I'm not saying it wouldn't be there anyway, but I mean, that is it is a problem that there's messaging in the survey itself that would affect those answers. That's my impression in any case.
Ezra, that's certainly always a challenge. I'll note that the results we're presenting are not necessarily in the exact order that people took the survey. So I could tease that out more in a separate conversation, but this is a summary reel of the survey results and not exactly how you would have experienced it if you were actually clicking the survey. And Edelman did a really good job of trying to help make sure that we weren't projecting through the questions specific answers.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I hear your concern. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Okay, slide 20. So we asked folks how about their interest in participating in an electrification program in the next, and an incentivized electrification program in the next 12 months. And we defined electrification as switching from natural gas to electric options. As you can see, there's lots of interest across various demographics. But this was probably one of the most varied response sets that you'll see in the slides. You notice a lot of the other ones had similar size bars of purple, green, blue, et cetera. This one varied quite a bit more, with that largest bar in the somewhat interested category. Next slide, please. We also asked how strongly do people support different types of resources for balancing intermittent resources. So we explained in the intro about how wind and solar are intermittent resources and that it takes other resource capabilities to balance those. And then we asked them what they supported most. And probably not a huge surprise here that advanced nuclear is at the bottom of the list. But I think this is an interesting question. I was particularly surprised personally just that utility scale batteries were lower on the list than what I would have expected.
And hey, Ray, we have a question in the chat from Lisa for the electrification side. Was there any mention of programs, including incentives, that could help?
Yes, can you go back to the previous slide? I think that Lisa, I'd have to go back and look at the original question. I think there was some additional information. So it just said, how interested would you be in participating in an electrification program in the next 12 months? But I'm almost certain that we had some incentive language in there around that.
And then Quinn.
And, Quinn?
Yeah, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, to the extent that, like, what extent were the technologies in the intermittent resource slide explained, like, to people, like, if you don't know what a utility scale battery is? like how likely are you to be like, yeah, that seems like a good idea?
It's a good question, Quinn. We had a section where we defined these resources at a high level. So anytime you're doing research like this, it's a challenge to know for sure what people understood and to what degree. And they're also influenced by, the media that's in their community or the conversations that are happening. So I can't say for sure, but we did make an attempt to define these for folks, including things like advanced nuclear and batteries.
Thanks. I don't see any other questions for now, Ray, so I think it's okay to keep moving.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide then. We're getting close to the end here. So we asked folks here again, thinking about resources that we'll need in the future, under what condition do you support the use of natural gas to produce electricity? To really dive deeper in to natural gas, knowing that it'll be an important load balancing resource in our portfolio in future years, in the next several years at least, until other peaking resources are emerged. And I think we see some support for natural gas here, although only the first statement exceeds 50% for a couple of audiences. So probably no surprises here, but it is interesting to see how it varies depending on the use case. Okay, next slide. I think maybe two more. And these are higher level. So we asked folks on a scale of 1 to 10, how concerned are you about climate change? Obviously, customers are at least somewhat concerned about climate change. And there may be some prizes within the data here, but nothing too shocking across the board. And one more slide for us. I'm checking. I don't see any other questions. And the last one today, I don't think this was the last one in the survey, but just in general, based on what you know, what you've read, do you personally support or oppose a clean energy transformation? Not surprising from the other results, lots of support across the board. Some variation, obviously, by different communities, but that's pretty expected. And I think, Annie, that's my last slide.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, Quinn, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I have two questions. On the slide two up, the conditions to support natural gas. Was there a question on like, what if you just don't support the use of natural gas to produce electricity at all? Or would that fall under none of the above?
Well, in each one of these questions, you could have said, I do not support it under this condition, if that makes sense.
Okay. Hence, none of the above would be the answer that would reflect that.
Right.
And I think my second question to like, to what extent is like any of this kind of actionable? Like if 75% of people had said, yeah, let's stay on gas, despite state laws, like what what would you have done? Like, so to like what extent does that any of this like feedback meaningful or useful to PSE? Like it's good to see that a lot of people support the energy transition. Like it's on the books. It's so long as it's law, it's happening. But I mean, especially like with willingness to pay and things like that kind of is you're probably not getting a constant like 5% drip of cost increases and things like that. And we know that, like, but like, to what extent is any of this kind of useful going forward?
Sure. It's a great question, Quinn, and I think I saw similar questions in the chat from a few folks. What I would say, and I don't I'm not the person, Jen may have a thought about this on the ISP side, but I would say in general, we often think we know what our customers feel about different issues. But a survey like this helps us better understand the things we think we know and if they're right or if they're wrong. And I would say, as someone who does work directly in the field with customers who and talk to them on a semi-regular basis, not as much as some of my colleagues, this feedback aligns with what we're hearing. So it does, to some degree, help validate the anecdotal or the qualitative messages that we hear. What it doesn't do is tell us which portfolio to select or what the right decision in the ISP is. That's what we all get to do over the next year or so. But hopefully this information can be in the back of all of our minds as you think about the feedback you give us, as PSE thinks about the decisions that we have to make. We have a better sense of what a good segment of our customers are telling us.
Thanks, Ray. And similar questions in the chat. So I think it would be that same answer or response. Was there anybody else from PSE that wanted to chime in on that question? Okay. And then Ray, I think that was your last slide. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that was it. If you all have other questions, please, you can always submit them via the email address of the feedback form. I'm happy to try to respond, or not try, happy to respond in writing later.
Yeah, of course, of course. Well, great. We have a little extra time, so any other questions before we wrap this section?
Extra time, Annie. I felt like I was going to be way over. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm reading the agenda right? Just making sure.
I think so.
Correct. Good. Okay. Well, so we have a choice, right? Kind of lean to you. We could either do a break early or get started on the next section and take a break in about 15 minutes. What do you recommend here?
That next section is
long.
It is kind of long. So I think I'm kind of inclined to see if we can find a natural spot in those slides to take a break, just to let people pause and digest a little bit.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. Okay, perfect.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Ray. And thank you all for your questions and challenges and thoughtfulness on the survey. Okay, so we're going to move into our next conversation, which, as Ray mentioned, is a long one, and hopefully engaging with all of you. And so just a reminder, I know we're so used to not being on video, but if you are willing to be on video a bit today, we'd love to see your faces, just so members can get to know each other a bit more. But with that, I'll go ahead and introduce the next section. So we're going to be talking about Puget Sound Energy Resource Adequacy Study. And today we are going to take about, let's see, I think we have about 95 minutes for this. We've got Elizabeth Hosner with PSE and then Michaela Levine from E3. And so Elizabeth and Michaela, I'd love to hand this over to you. And then in about maybe 15, 20 minutes, if there's a natural break, we could take a quick break for folks to get a stretch in.
That's
Elizabeth. Okay, great. Just making sure you're there. Okay. Hi, Michaela.
Elizabeth, did you want to say anything before I jump into it?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Finding the mute buttons. Yeah, thank you. And we have E3 here. This is a kind of callback to a presentation they did last spring where we set up the methodology for the resource adequacy analysis. And now they're coming back to kind of go through the results, how we're sitting with the peak capacity deficit and the peak credits for the resources. So this, I will then come back after Michaela's presentation to kind of go through how we'll be using this in the ISP process. So I'll hand this over to Michaela. Thank you.
Okay, we can go to the next slide and get started. Hi all, I'm Michaela Levine. I'm a senior managing consultant in E3's integrated system planning group. And I'm also joined on the phone with my colleague, Erin Burdick, who's a director in our ISP group. So 3 broad items on our agenda today. First is just to provide some more background on resource adequacy. This section is going to retrace a lot of the ground that E3 covered when we were here with y'all at the RPAG meeting in the spring. And then we'll get into some significant and meaningful changes that were made in the 27 ISP analysis compared to the previous resource adequacy analyses that E3 has supported PSE on. And then we'll get into the results. We'll look at PSE's planning reserve margin, their capacity shortfall, or the need for additional resources they're going to try to fill in their portfolio analysis in the 27 ISP, and ELCC results for resources that they could use to fill those gaps. We can move to the next slide. So just to briefly introduce E3, we have extensive experience performing resource adequacies across the country. And specifically, we also have a lot of experience in the Northwest too. We've done a lot of modeling of reliability in the Northwest and have worked with PSE on the resource adequacy analysis for the 2023 Electric Progress Report, as well as the 2025 analysis. To do this modeling, E3 uses our proprietary loss of load probability model recap, which I'll talk about a lot more in the coming slides as we get into the methodology. We can go to the next slide, another skip forward here. First, before we get into it, I just wanted to define some terminology so we have a good basis of common language as we're moving through this presentation. The first term I wanted to define is the planning reserve margin. So the planning reserve margin is effectively just the total amount of capacity that PSE needs to meet a reliability target. PSE plans their system to what is called a 0.1 LOE, or loss of load expectation. So that's eventually saying that they have enough resources in the long run that on average, they would be able to meet their load under all conditions, except for maybe one event in 10 years. The planning reserve margin is often presented as kind of a percentage of additional resources above PSE's 1 and 2 median peak load. The next term I want to define here on the right is effective load carrying capability, or ELCC. ELCC is effectively the equivalent perfect capacity that a resource can provide to meeting PSE's reliability target. No resource is perfectly reliable. Thermal resources like gas have forced outage rates, which could reduce their ability to contribute during times of critical system need. Renewable resources like wind and solar have varying output on an hourly by hour basis that limit their ability to contribute in all system conditions which they might be needed. Same thing with energy storage resources. They're kind of limited in their ability to charge and discharge when needed. They are energy limited resources that can't always be called upon, or can run out of state of charge to serve load when they're called upon. So in our analysis, E3 quantifies ELCCs for both existing and generic resources. Kind of what's illustrated here in this graphic is kind of an ELCC accreditation in theory for all of PSE's resources. So the sum of PSE's resources and how they contribute to the reliability needs. The difference between that and their planning reserve margin is the capacity shortfall, which we'll focus on today in more detail in the presentation as we move forward. But that shortfall is essentially what PSE is looking to fill when they do their portfolio analysis. That planning reserve margin really sets a key constraint into their portfolio analysis model, and the need to meet the reliability target is really driven by what that shortfall looks like. We can move to the next slide. I think this one, we can go forward another one too. I think this will also be familiar to folks who attended our spring meeting, just going over the workflow for the resource adequacy analysis. Broadly, we start, going from left to right with a number of inputs that PSE provided to E3. A lot of these inputs are also used elsewhere in PSE's ISP modeling. So there's good consistency across the resource adequacy analysis and the rest of the workflow to produce the ISP. With all these inputs, E3 runs our recap model, our loss load probability model, and develops planning reserve margins for 2 years and 2 seasons. So setting that capacity need for PSE system, as well as developing ELCCs for different resources. And we do that considering saturation effects and interactive effects that could reduce the ability of a resource to contribute as the penetration of it increases. So all those inputs then feed into PSE's portfolio expansion model, which will produce a optimal portfolio of resources. And then PSE will hand that portfolio back to E3's recap model to do a backend reliability check, just making sure that that portfolio would provide a reliable system for PSE. In the next few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the key inputs that are highlighted in this diagram. One of those is the hourly load profiles, and another is renewable profiles. So this table here is highlighting some of the key methodology changes we made between the 2025 analysis and the 2027 ISP analysis. A critical dynamic to capture in resource adequacy modeling is the correlation between load and renewable generation, as they're both highly weather driven. So maybe a hot summer day also happens to be a nice sunny day, and solar can contribute significantly on those types of conditions. So in the previous 2025 analysis, the hourly load profiles, defining a range of weather conditions and load conditions that PSE must plan to meet, was produced by PSE using climate-informed temperature data from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. In this cycle, E3 produced these hourly load profiles using historical decharge temperature data, and in the coming slides, we'll get into more detail about exactly what that means. With that reliance upon historical temperature data, E3 was also able to produce renewable profiles that represent that same underlying hourly weather conditions that is in the load profiles as well. So that was a key methodology improvement that was made in this cycle. This table also highlights 2 other key changes, which we'll spend less time talking about today, but one was how we represented the availability of the market in PSE's recap model. Previously, these inputs were generated by PSE using the Genesis and WPCM model. In this cycle, we leveraged some additional modeling that E3 has been conducting on the region to develop a profile for what PSE can use the market for. As we go forward too, we're going to talk about the PSE's capacity shortfall. And as PSE is looking to enter RAP, they're looking both to reduce their reliance upon the market, as well as fill any kind of shortfall they have. So we'll be looking at kind of what that picture would mean to move away from the market as well. And then the last change here too, is just a note on how PSE has updated their kind of accounting framework. This change in accounting framework has no impact whatsoever on what the shortfall is. A shortfall is a shortfall. This is just how kind of resources are represented in this accounting framework. In particular for those existing resources.
Yeah, hey Quinn, there's a question.
Yeah, hi Michaela. I'm curious about what some of the differences between the 2025 data and the data used for the 27 ISP. I know you'll get into the detrended temperature data in a little bit. I do have some questions about that, but yeah, I'm a little bit curious about why the switch between Genesis to PGP's public generating pool, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what about the switch made sense?
I think it's also connected to the desire to have this correlation between the hourly load and renewable profiles. We were able to use in that PGP model kind of the same weather conditions too. So those were able to get translated over to this model as well. So there's kind of a preservation of correlation there.
Yeah, I just feel a pop up. I just wanted to add one more thing, or a couple. I think one is what Michaela just said, which was that, and this was one y'all may recall that E3 kind of did a summary of our process for us last time, and gave us a number of recommendations. And one of the things that they recommended was making sure that we could align those temperatures with renewable conditions, right? The intermittent renewable conditions is an important one. The other one is that what we had been doing was using the classic Genesis model, right? So that's the old school Fortran version. And now, it's just becoming increasingly difficult for us to try and continue to use the old version of Genesis. So it just made sense for us to rather than us struggle with trying to do the kinds of correlation work that Michaela mentioned, have them do half of it. We might as well have them do the whole thing. This way, we're not doing half and they're doing half. In fact, we were doing half using the council's old Genesis model. So it seemed to make sense to us to have it all put in one consistent analytical framework. So we outsourced it to them completely. So.
Thanks, Philip. And I see Lauren's hand up.
Yeah, and I apologize if I missed this, and I am kind of a little bit out of the loop on what's happening with the council's model. But I guess, is there some technical reason why PSE can't use the new Genesis? I would want to really understand kind of the factors behind that decision to deviate from using the council's models, particularly given that those do go through a very, public review process with regional stakeholders, under the oversight of the council. Whereas I'm not really sure what the process has been for developing the PGP model, and if that has, kind of a similar rigorous type of public process associated with it or not. So yeah, just really maybe want to understand a little better the decision behind this change.
I guess I'm happy to start from E3's perspective.
Go ahead, Aaron. Go for it.
And then, yeah, feel free to add. So, yeah, I would say they're really across the industry, methods for incorporating future climate into resource adequacy studies are still in the emerging phase. The challenge being that a lot of the climate models don't have the same level of detail on sort of the tail event conditions that drive these probabilistic studies. So here we're looking at 40 plus years of weather, and we really care about the tail conditions within that long data set. How you perturb both the average and the extremes in a temperature data set over time with future climate is still an emerging topic without what we would view as kind of a settled science there. So the method that we've used here is what we view as kind of the best in class, which is to take the known changes that we know have happened in the past and say, okay, we're going to base our modeling on today's climate. So that involves this detrending that Michaela will dig deeper in a minute here. So that gives us basically kind of a starting point from today. It doesn't capture as much of the potential space that the climate might change into in the future and what the potential downstream impacts of that are. But we feel this is a bit more kind of grounded in the data that we know and have historically relied on in these types of RA studies.
Just a follow-up, I think maybe for Puget, but I guess I would want to know if this is like at this point, are you settling on using this methodology for the ISP, or are you also going to look at the results that you would get if you use the council's model?
Well, this is Philip again. You keep in mind that that we did last time, we didn't use the council's model exclusively, right? So it was a hybrid kind of approach.
Yep.
And we used the classic Genesis, which was in Fortran, as opposed to the new version of Genesis. And I don't know if anybody else uses that or if we could even use it. But given that it made a whole lot more sense to try and make sure that we got those data aligned, right? Especially those hourly temperatures and intermittent resource conditions. That even if we were using the council's data that wasn't aligned in the same way, now you're still kind of doing some mixing and matching, right? So we felt it was better to have this data done all consistently by E3, who does this all over the country for folks, rather than continue to try and piece it together halfway, right? If we're going to outsource it, let's go ahead and outsource this. And this is the kind of thing that, resource adequacy is really a lot bigger than an individual utility, right? So getting the rest of that market piece right is really important. So we really wanted to go with that approach of having we liked the consistency of the data, the way that E3 was setting it up, and they have a really good reputation for doing this sort of work in a lot of different places. So that's really the reason why we went with that. So there's not like hey, let's go back and do the old way. That's not, that we don't have that.
Okay, and I'll just say I look forward to understanding this a little bit better. I think from my perspective, the more we collectively can adhere to the regional models, the better chances we have of I think ultimately what we want to do, which is plan as a region, and we want the utilities to kind of have some consistent assumptions in how they're looking at resource adequacy. So I don't know, maybe could have an offline conversation with the team about this. Thanks.
Thanks, Lauren and Philip, for that back and forth.
I think, Annie, I'm probably at a good spot for a potential pause, or I could probably go for another 5 or 10 minutes. What do you think?
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask you that. So I think now is a good time. We were planning to do it at 2 anyways. So it's 2:05. Why don't we take a 10-minute break till 2:15, and then we can keep going from the slide with Michaela. Thank you. All right, folks, welcome back. It's 2:15, so we'll get started again. Hopefully you all got a nice little break there. And I did get one question about whether we are still recording. And yes, we are. So for folks that do have to leave early, I've gotten a couple messages that we are recording today and it will be posted on the PSC website. And Ben, if you don't mind posting where people can find that in the chat, just a quick reminder there. And if you haven't already, feel free to bookmark it. That's always a nice way to be able to get your hands on the recordings really quickly. Okay, Michaela, do you want to keep going with this topic?
Yep. We can go to the next slide and get started. So in the next few slides, I'll go through, one of the most significant changes we were just discussing for the cycle, which was how E3 generated load profiles for a range of weather conditions to go into our LLP modeling. So to do this analysis, E3 used our reclaim model, which is an artificial neural net model, basically a machine learning model. This machine learning model is trained on a couple of key inputs. One is historical hourly temperature data sets. Another is kind of a daytime variable index, day of week, holiday, hour of the day, etc. And then we also use hourly historical loads into our training data. For training purposes, we look at kind of a near-term set of years. We use that kind of near-term set of years to kind of reflect the mix of end uses that are in PSE system. And we try to keep our training data set as small as we reasonably can so that we don't introduce the impacts of like economic growth into our model, etc. So after we've trained the model, and here we used 2015 to 2022 to train the model, we then feed into the model a longer time series of data set, a longer time series to get like a really large sample of weather conditions to model into our loss of load probability modeling. So here we're put into the model weather conditions that reflect 1979 to 2022, and then we get out of that hourly simulated load. This process we're describing here is really just get the base load. And so we're training the model on kind of existing loads and to simulate kind of base load as well. I think on one of the previous slides we were just looking at in terms of the workflow, on top of this, we also layer on EV load growth too, which has a distinct shape that was generated by PSE for that modeling. We can go to the next slide. And, as noticed in that slide, and as we were discussing, we're not just using historical temperatures, we're using what we describe as detrended historical temperatures. So these graphs here are showing kind of the summer daily average maxima and winter daily minimum temperatures seen throughout the time horizon we are using data for. To kind of isolate the impact of climate change, we do a linear detrending of the temperatures. So effectively, this does have the impact of reducing the amount of variability we see when we look at the historical record on temperature. But it isolates that impact of just the warming that has been seen over the past 40 years from these temperature data sets. Climate change does get then layered back into the analysis. The goal here is just to get a range of the variability in load. So how does a 1 in 10 extreme year compare to a 1 in 2 based off of this historical data? And then we scale the load profiles to PSE's peak load forecast, their kind of 1 in 2 forecast, which, their forecasting process also considers the impact of warming temperatures over time on their winter peak, as well as increasing temperatures on their summer peak load. We can go to the next slide here and just look at some of these results. So these temperatures here, these plots here are showing in summer and winter the daily peak load over the entire data set we have relative to what the 1 and 2 median peak is. So on the left here, we're seeing summer, the 2020-25 analysis in the red line, and the 27 ISP in the blue line. And we see in general, kind of this variability in summer is pretty similar between these two data sets that were used in loss load probability modeling. But we're seeing just a greater divergence in winter on the right. We see more kind of extreme peak days in winter with this new data set and this new modeling pathway than was seen with the 2025 profiles that PSE generated.
Yeah. Hey, Michaela, Quinn's got a question.
Hi, Michaela. I'm curious about, I have two things, one on the previous slide, but I'll get to this one first. I'm curious about why the winter peaks are so much worse than the summer.
why is the winter peak so much worse than the summer in terms
Yes.
of the variability we see?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think part of that is just like what we see in the historical temperature. There's just more range and variability in the winter minimum temperature over that. PSE also is a system with a lot of electric heating already. So there's a lot of like weather dependent loads in winter. PSE's system maybe historically has had less like air conditioning penetration. Maybe that's increasing over time. But I think in general, there's just like a lot of weather dependent loads. And so when you have weather variability, that really shows up in the variability of the load profiles too.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm still a little confused on the previous slide about the idea of the detrended data to then kind of account for future climate change.
Yeah, I think our goal here is to really say, like in the present, what is the range of in any given year, like of the variability in temperature? I think as Erin was describing before, literature is much more established that there is an overall warming trend, but the literature on like what the tail end events look like and the probability of those is less well established here. So we're really relying upon what we see as kind of like a normalized range of variability historically by doing this detrending, just like isolating kind of the average warming effect we see over time from the overall variability.
Okay.
I think we can move forward unless there's any other question here. All right, so this is kind of a little preview of some of the underlying dynamics that will explain the results we go through in the next few slides here. The chart on the right are showing a histogram of the duration of loss of load events. So the x-axis there is how long is a loss of load event in all the simulations, E3 models and recap. And the y-axis is showing how frequent those are. The top chart is looking at an analysis from the 2025 analysis in winter, and the bottom is looking at the 27 ISP. And so the first thing to see between these two charts is that there are just many more events with longer loss of load durations in the 27 ISP model. In the previous modeling effort, we didn't see loss of load events, longer than 5 hours. But in this analysis, we're seeing events that are longer than 5 hours and even reaching into the 15-hour range. Both of these models in winter, show loss of load occurring both in kind of a morning peak period and an evening peak period. But with this 27 ISP model, we do see some events that span both kind of that morning peak period and the evening peak period in winter. And another thing we see in this 27 ISP model with these weather profiles is that we see, back-to-back days that are challenging for the system. We see 2 consecutive days where there is loss of load in the 27 ISP model, which was just not something we observed with the load profiles and the system that was being modeled in the 2025 analysis.
And then it looks like Dennis asked, why is that change?
Yeah, and it's all about those load profiles, really. I think we're seeing, by using this historical data, that we're seeing kind of periods of extended cold snaps. We're seeing days where we're replicating in PSE system kind of a really high load across the entire day from morning to evening, as well as kind of multi-day cold events that drive kind of reliability risks for the region or for PSE system. Those kind of back-to-back days where there's just it's challenging to meet load are being captured here with those new load profiles. Okay. That all's making sense to folks. We can move forward here. And next, I'm going to just talk about how PSE's capacity shortfall has changed. We can move to the next slide here. And this table will just provide a brief summary of, we talked about methodology changes here, but here's just getting into a little bit more of the data inputs and how those drive the change in capacity shortfall. That capacity, The first thing called out here in the table is just PSE's 1 and 2 or median peak load forecasts. We're seeing a slight decrease in both winter and summer for that. We're modeling a load forecast now that has conservation embedded in the RA analysis. As we were just talking about on the previous slides, we have that change in the interannual variability in load now that we're using these profiles E3 generated using historical determined temperature. And effectively, we have decreased the variability in summer relative to the data set that was used in the 25 analysis, but have increased it in winter. So that has opposing impacts upon what pressure that puts on PSE's capacity shortfall. The kind of fourth, fifth, and sixth lines here are kind of a lumped together in kind of new procurement, new resources, and change of PSE's resource portfolio. PSE has procured some new additional kind of firm contracts, as well as Brookfield hydro contracts, some new wind and solar and storage resources, and then also a slight change to their mid-sea and other hydro resource capacities. All in all, as we'll see in the next slides, these have put significant downward pressure on PSE's capacity shortfall and have reduced kind of the gap they need to plan to fill compared to what was seen in the 2025 analysis. Okay, so we can get into those results now. Next slide here, or I can pause it.
And yeah, I see Lauren's hand up if we want to go to Lauren.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you just go back to the other slide for a second? So I just want to clarify for the mid-sea and other hydro, that is what you're referencing there in the 2027 ISP is just what, the expiration of current contracts, or what's happening in that column?
Yeah, I'll let PSE comment on like specific contractual changes, but overall, just the capacity of mid-sea and those hydro resources that we're assuming are going to be existing in 2031 has decreased.
Yeah, we just have changes to contracts that we're picking up. So these are changes to contracts. We also have the new resources coming in. So this is also a look at 2031. So this is the view of what our portfolio will be in 2031. There's just been a lot of changes over the last year that we're just accounting for at this time.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, let's move to the next slide. So here's kind of a waterfall chart illustrating how all the changes made from the 2025 analysis to the 27 ISP analysis have impacted PSE's capacity shortfall that they're looking to fill when they go into their portfolio expansion analysis. So on the left here was the capacity shortfall identified in the 2025 analysis. And so PSE had about a 3 gigawatt shortfall in 2031 to fill in that work. The next two, small green bars here are showing the impact of that decrease, kind of median peak forecast, a small decrease in the forecast, as well as a small change in how PSE is representing operating reserves in the model, have put downward pressure on their shortfall. Here we're looking at winter, and as we were talking about with those new load profiles, we are seeing more interannual variability in winter peak loads, and so that has put upward pressure on PSE shortfall. And then this third or last green bar on the right shows the impact of mostly all of that procurement and changes in PSE's portfolio that Elizabeth was just calling out. PSE has added a bunch of wind resources, solar resources, new contracts and storage resources, and a little bit of decrease in that mid-sea hydro resource. And so all in all, that resource additions and the previous other changes to the model has effectively decreased PSE's capacity shortfall in winter by about 600 megawatts compared to the 2025 analysis. So we go to the next slide, we can look at this for summer. So same kind of chart here in summer. The difference here is we don't have any of that red bar that was putting an upward pressure on PSE's capacity shortfall. With these new load profiles, we see less interannual variability in summer in PSE system. All of that procurement has had a pretty big impact on reducing PSE's capacity shortfall, going from about a 3 gigawatt shortfall in the previous analysis down to about a 1 gigawatt shortfall. In the summer picture, we're seeing that procurement maybe has had a larger impact on reducing PSE's capacity shortfall need. Some of those storage resources and solar resources are really, better suited to meeting kind of the winter reliability challenges that the summer reliability challenges that PSE sees in their system compared to the winter challenges where we see kind of extended multi-day cold snaps that are challenging to serve load during. Next, we can move into some of the generic resource ELCC modeling E3 did. And so these are, before we do that, I guess we have one more slide here on this. You can go forward one, just to kind of put the previous 2 slides together in summary. Here's a table that captures all of that information that was in those waterfall graphics. This table shows the 1 and 2 peak load forecasts in the first row, what the PRM percentages are in the 2025 analysis versus the 27 ISP analysis, what that means for PSE's total resource need, and then what was the capacity shortfall. So what is that kind of gap that PSE needs to fill as they're going into their portfolio analysis. And so really that last row on this chart here was kind of what we were focusing on. And this table here is what we were focusing on those previous charts. This is PSE's capacity shortfall position, inclusive of how much we modeled them relying upon the market currently as they're trying to close that market reliance in this work. Okay. Yeah, so now we can move on to generic resource ELCCs. So these are effectively the ELCC metrics we generated for PSE's generic resources. So what resource options is PSE going to model in their portfolio analysis to fill that capacity shortfall and meet their total resource need? How are those accredited? So this first slide here just provides kind of a snapshot of different types of resources that were modeled and different metrics and what the kind of metrics look like generally for those different types of resources. So here, kind of in that gray line, we're seeing the ELCC for a combined cycle. So here's a firm thermal resource, has a high ELCC and one that doesn't really degrade as you increase its penetration of it. Here we're also showing the ELCCs for some variable and energy limited resources. So those energy limited resources like storage, even 100-hour, both 4-hour lithium ion and 100-hour iron air storage, both show kind of declining incremental ELCCs as you increase their penetration as those resources start to saturate. Similarly, we also see that for those kind of wind and solar resources as well. We see kind of lower ELCC curves in general for those that kind of decrease quickly, as you exceed about 1,000 megawatts of incremental capacity addition of those types of resources. And we generally see kind of solar resources are a challenging resource to try to use to fill PSE's winter reliability needs.
Michaela, there was one question on the prior slide from Lisa Schwartz about the high PRM in winter. So I just wanted to make sure we answer that. So that relates to the earlier slide that Michaela showed around the winter variability that we see using the historical temperature and load data. So there we see, up to 15 or 20% higher than median peaks during the most extreme winter tail event conditions that we model. So that's what's driving the high winter PRM.
Thanks. Looks like John also had a question.
Yeah, thanks. My question was actually on the ELCC slide, if that would be okay. I was interested in to what do you attribute the cratering of the 100-hour iron air ELCC? Is that due to some sort of market limitation? I will just say, like in the past, when we've done analysis on this, it's kind of limited by how much energy you can get. Is that kind of the situation here. There was like some sort of limit that you couldn't get more than what, 1500 or something, and then it started to degrade, or
Yeah, I think you're thinking about this right, John. What we saw was kind of an energy insufficiency issue. So at higher penetrations of that 100 hours storage, there's just not enough energy that's not being used kind of at off-peak hours or during hours that aren't really where the system isn't tight to like recharge those storage resources to then be available when they're needed. So it's just a little bit, yeah, there's an energy sufficiency challenge there.
And I guess the second thing I was going to ask is, I think in the past, and I'm not sure if I'm remembering this correctly, do you folks look at this kind of from a like a portfolio perspective? So obviously there's the capability in some of these ELCCs that you wouldn't just add one resource alone, right? You would add a combination of resources. And so how does that play in with kind of the energy only, well, the more energy focused resources like say like a renewable, and then the storage resources? How did you look at them in tandem?
I think there's a couple parts here. We do our best in this analysis, like capture all the interactive effects between resources. So we model these resource additions relative to PSE's existing portfolio. So the kind of adding, 100 megawatts of storage that could use some of PSE's existing resources to charge. In this model too, we also are doing all the tuning up to the reliability standard. And so that means having to add a lot of perfect capacity, which isn't, an existing PSE resource, but represents kind of that a lot of, new generation resources would be added to the system to meet the reliability standard, and those could be used to charge storage.
We also did some exploration of the diversity benefits of adding wind and storage together on top of the existing system. And that led to some, I would say, relatively minor adjustments to the storage curves here, adjusting them up a bit because of that benefit of adding energy resources together with them. We generally found that to be not as strong between wind and storage as solar and storage in a summer peaking system, for instance, but we did explore that and incorporate that analysis.
Yeah, thanks. I guess just one follow-up to that last piece. For the wind and storage, was it the wind in the long duration, or was it primarily the wind in the short duration that you were looking at there? Or is it both?
We primarily were focusing kind of that particular analysis on like the 4-hour storage.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we'll just flag, we do see this drop off in the 100-hour storage, but it's at quite a high penetration. So, we're approaching, almost 40% of the peak load being served by 100-hour iron air batteries before we really see that drop off. So that would be quite a deep penetration. Doesn't look like this because we go all the way out to 5,000 megawatts, but it is quite a high penetration of the peak.
I just wanted to add one more thing real quick, and that is, John, to your question about the portfolio effects, the interactive effects, right? Because all of these things, if we're doing a marginal ELCC, that's in one dimension, not multiple dimensions, right? But I think that's one of those reasons why, as Michaela mentioned, we need to take a look at that once we get that preferred portfolio, right? We have to run that through the RA model to see, is it in the ballpark of reasonable, right? Are there enough resources, or have we added way too much? Have we not added enough? So, rather than trying to figure out each of the, all of the dimensions to that marginal equation, we'll use them in this manner and then make sure that it still works, right? Because we're hoping they will still get you a system that's adequate, not too adequate, not short, right? So that's the reason for checking on the back end, I think.
Yep. And then looks like we have a question from Quinn.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. So the ELCC on the iron air battery is in part kind of dependent on like the availability of the resources you could charge it with. So in theory, the more resources you would have to charge it with, the better the ELCC would be, up to a certain point anyway.
Yeah, the ELCC could, if you weren't in like an energy constrained system, the ELCC could look a little better, but there's still, saturation effects that happen with both, the 4-hour and the 100-hour storage, where you can flatten that peak as you can keep flattening that peak, but then to keep flattening the peak another megawatt, you have to add continuing longer and longer durations of storage to be able to accomplish that. So that dynamic that applies to 4-hour, and I think it's discussed a lot with 4-hour, kind of also applies to 100-hour storage too.
Yeah, if you could always have your 100-hour storage charged, it would have a lot higher ELCC here. But because you lose 60% of the energy that you put into it, once you do start to encounter the kind of flattening of the net peak, potentially across multiple days that Michaela outlined, that round trip efficiency, the low round trip efficiency of the 100-hour storage really makes a difference in kind of the sharpish decline here. Again, at a high penetration, but once you do hit that sort of multi-day saturation, that's what we're seeing here.
Okay. I don't think there's any other questions, so feel free to keep going if you'd like.
Yeah, let's move forward. The next slide, we're just going to focus on one of the ELCCs that changed most significantly between the 25 and 27 ISP analyses. So these charts here are showing the ELCC curves we generated for 4-hour storage for winter on the left and summer on the right, showing both the 2025 analysis and 27 ISP analysis next to each other in the same chart. One thing to note here is, this x-axis we're showing is relative to absolute zero. So what is this curve before PSE added any storage to their portfolio? But PSE has procured some storage since we did the 2025 IRP analysis, about 500 megawatts of it. And so that's illustrated in that red line of like, what is the existing storage penetration? So that procurement, alone has the impact of pushing PSE down their saturation curve for storage, and reducing kind of the ELCCs you would see for the next increment of storage that could be procured. That said, these curves look pretty different from each other, even without considering that saturation point. And so a lot of the difference in these curves, why we see a sooner and steeper drop off for ELCCs for storage, particularly in that winter curve on the left, is in large part driven by those new load profiles we have. And if you recall, when we looked a few slides back at those histograms of loss of load events and the duration of those, in the previous analysis, most of those were below 5 hours. And so having kind of a system tight for just a few hours, 4-hour storage can work pretty well there. But if you have a system where you have loss of load events, a reliability need for more than 4 hours, sometimes maybe 10 or 15 hours, a 4-hour storage resource has much less value.
And hey, Michaela, I could be wrong, but there was a question in the chat from earlier. I wasn't sure if you already addressed this from Lisa, the one about the geographic spread of wind plants.
I think our next 2 slides will get to that.
Oh, okay, perfect. Then Lisa, you'll get that response here shortly.
Yeah. So we can move forward. So here are the ELCC's curves E3 generated for wind resources. So E3 modeled quite a few different wind resources, some in the Northwest, some in the Rockies, also some resources, some offshore wind, some Idaho wind, and some North Dakota wind as well. So these curves here are kind of plotting the incremental additions relative to PSE's existing wind portfolio, of adding these together to their portfolio. So generally see, wind resources have higher ELCCs in winter than in summer. And so they can be a more effective resource for meeting winter reliability needs compared to how effective they are in summer. But all these curves are really showing us steep declines with penetrations kind of beyond 1,000 megawatts. We can go to the next slide. And so similarly for the previous slide, this chart is showing all of the ELCC curves that E3 generated for solar resources and for all the different geographies modeled. So we looked at, a couple of different geographies as well as looking at DER solar as well. Here, kind of unsurprisingly, the summer ELCCs are just like a little bit higher and persist a little bit higher than you would expect in summer. But we do see some small amount of ELCC value kind of in that first tranche in winter due to the system being kind of energy limited and energy limited. See Lisa's question, why the ELCC declines over 1,000 megawatts since you modeled a wide geographic spread. So I guess here we can back up to the wind resources aside. Each of these curves represents kind of a single type of wind resource. And so we're capturing the saturation of those. In PSE's portfolio modeling, they'll kind of try to manage kind of the number of curves shown here. So even though this is like 1,000 megawatts of Washington East wind, we're kind of adding a very similar profile. We're adding like the same wind profile for all of that, like first 1,000 megawatts and next 1,000 megawatts of Washington East wind, which leads to kind of some steep saturation.
So are you saying that, I mean, it almost sounds like then that statement was kind of the statement about the ELCC declining is somewhat meaningless because in the actual portfolio modeling that PSC will do when they're bringing together, the best combination of resources to meet their needs, if they choose a wide geographic spread to complement different load profiles and don't concentrate 1,000 megawatts, in the same place, then we won't see the same ELCC declines. Is that, I'm not sure if that's what you're saying, Michaela.
I think that, the ELCC declines are what is shown here, but if the PSE's like portfolio model finds it's optimal to not get too far down any one of these saturation curves and kind of picks a little bit of wind from each region, those like wind resources selected by the model will have like a higher ELCC.
Right, that's a huge qualification, an important one. Thanks.
Yeah, and a lot of that is the economic optimization, which is kind of separate from what we're doing here with our analysis.
Yeah, and to tack on, I mean, with Lisa's question, that is correct. We'll be putting all this in the models with their saturations, ELCCs, and all the interactive effects that resources have together. And I'll go through this afterwards, how we'll be going through the modeling. But you're right, this is all part of the optimization modeling to figure out the best mix of resources, looking at different locations, and making sure you're not saturating too far into the different types of resources.
Okay. I think we have just a few more slides to cover. I think we can move forward 2 slides. Okay, so this table here is just summarizing the change in renewable resource ELCCs between the 2025 analysis and 2027 ISP analysis. In this table, we're just showing kind of the next 100 megawatts of procurement for those resources. So we're not incorporating kind of the fact that PSE has already procured some more wind resources since the last analysis. This is just looking at the next 100 megawatts based off where they were at the 2025 analysis versus where they are now at the 27 ISP analysis as their starting point. A lot of what is driving these changes has to do with that other big methodology change we discussed previously, which was that E3 generated renewable profiles using a bunch of toolkits from NREL. which are representing historical renewable generation profile that were renewable generation, which were able to correlate with those historical temperature-driven profiles as well. So that's another kind of impact here on the ELCCs, both, first that saturation of resources that have already been procured since the previous analysis, as well as kind of just the change in renewable profiles, which are a little bit harder to disentangle.
Yeah, and those can go in opposite directions. So for instance, you see here some of the wind ELCCs have declined. So that could both be due to saturation with the extra wind we have in the portfolio. It also could be to better capturing the correlations of those cold snap conditions and the generally low wind output within the same region that we see during that type of weather. And then we see solar winter ELCCs actually increasing. So that may be due both to the correlation of what's going on with the sun on those coldest days. So it might be really cold, but it's also could be sunny and not windy. And then we also have some of the more extended loss of load risk hours that Michaela mentioned earlier. So that hurts storage because there's longer duration risk, but it can actually help solar because some of the energy that is available during the middle of the day may actually support reliability versus having a more narrow peak outside of the solar hours. So, it's not always easy to disentangle all of these interactions, but, basing our analysis on the fundamentals view of let's capture weather, load, and renewables together using best practices allows us to have confidence in these results.
Nice hand up from John.
Yeah, thank you. Just a question about the ELCC analysis. And I think you probably described this, and maybe I just blipped out for a second. Sorry, my daughter was a little bit sick last night, so um, my concentration isn't what it should be. But anyhow, when you're performing the ELCC analysis, a lot of times it's done on something that's near to an adequate system. Is that how this analysis was performed, or was it on a pretty inadequate system? Can you just reflect a little bit on some of the details of the analysis? Thanks.
Yeah, it's performed relative to an adequate system. So we have, start with PSE's system. We add perfect capacity to tune it up to the reliability target. We add in the resource. We see now we can remove some perfect capacity to get back to that target because adding that resource increased beyond the reliability target. So we're kind of measuring these ELCCs relative to hitting a reliability target that is, their 0.1 LLE standard.
And I guess what I was asking is how far below the LOLEV or the LOLE standard was it initially before the resource was added back in?
Well, that's what we show in the capacity shortfall analysis that we showed earlier. So there on PSE system in 2031, there is a substantial gap. So we're assuming that gap is going to get filled. And then we're looking at the effectiveness of different resources against the system act criteria. However, when we build out the curves that have ELCCs at increasing penetration, effectively we're eating into any perfect capacity that we use to tune back up the system. So if you build out the system and you march down that saturation curve, then you're capturing some of the dynamics of filling that full gap.
Yeah, and sorry, that was what I couldn't recall is how the gap was in comparison to kind of say PSE's load. And Mostly, sorry, this is just a little bit philosophical. Sometimes what I've seen in ELCC studies is depending on how big the gap is, sometimes you get slightly different results. And so that was mostly, I didn't know if you could, if you cared to reflect on that. I can't recall how big the gap was. It seemed like it was pretty large though. So that's why I was asking.
Yeah, the gap is pretty large. I think we could go back a few slides. We can show kind of that summary table. Bring that up again. Yeah, so this last row here, John has kind of like what that gap looks like. So it is about, 2 gigawatts in winter and about a gigawatt in summer in the 27 ISP analysis. The nature of loss of load events can look different in a system that is using a lot of perfect capacity to tune it to a reliable standard versus one that has different renewable storage, thermal used to meet that. And you're right, that can have an impact on LCCs.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks for, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah, we have explored this in the past, and what we've seen is it can actually it can even totally flip the signal, right? So in a really short system, you don't have enough energy on almost every day. And so there's basically no value for adding incremental storage. And there might be more value for adding renewables, regardless of the periods in which they generate, because you are energy short almost every day. So in our mind, that's kind of a distortion of the marginal incentives that you want to signal for new resources, assuming that you're going to tune the system to criteria, which is kind of standard practice for these studies.
Yep. And what you said is exactly what my concern was, which is sometimes when you get too deep, if you're in an energy short system, sometimes how well these capacity accreditations work for reflecting like something that's closer to a pure capacity resource like storage can be um, yeah, you don't really get the best signal always, right? You kind of have to do some normalizing. And I was mostly what I remember seeing is that this number was pretty large in comparison to the general load. And I was wondering if that was the situation we were in here. And that's why some of the storage numbers were lower. Anyway, I don't really have any other thoughts other than to reflect kind of, this discussion. And thanks for sharing your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so if we
excuse me, I was just going to add one more thing there, and that is I think that's again, I think that's why it's really important to do that back end check, right? Because all of these ELCCs that are being calculated, all these marginal ELCCs, right? You're really, the way I think we have to interpret them is it's the very last piece of the Tetris puzzle that you're putting in there. What's that very last piece worth? But you've added 2,300 megawatts of unicorns running on treadmills, right? That never get tired. And so I'm not going to have all those unicorns running on treadmills, but that's how we're doing it. It's perfect capacity. So what I'm a little bit concerned about is in the real world, the system that we're putting in place may be more energy limited than having a magical resource that can generate flat, or it can be dispatched on and off every hour at will. So but I think the only way to deal with that, this is the only way I've been able to figure it out, is that's, again, it comes back to, man, you better check on the back end to make sure, because you created all these slopes and you built a big old skyscraper out of a house of cards based on these slopes, and you better check at the end to make sure that the whole thing is standing the way you thought it was.
Yeah, I would say I agree broadly that it's always challenging to do a capacity accreditation and reserve margin planning, and the key thing to do is check on the end at the end for sure. The only reason I bring up this discussion at all is obviously when you're doing your optimization, you have to account for this accreditation and the reserve margin in some way, and that's part of it. So it's a question of how much that drives anything. But I 100% agree. You got to check for the adequate system at the end. That's the key rubber hits the road part. Some of it's a little bit of art here, Thanks for expanding for me. I was just trying to understand some of this, so
Yeah,
appreciate it.
no, and I'll tell you, and Elizabeth can chime in if I'm mistaken, but in the past when we've done that checking, it's always looked good. You know what I mean? It's always been close. So it's like theoretically, I don't know about all the slopes from all these different dimensions adding up, but when we have checked, we have not found like, oh no, we're several 100 megawatts short or several hundred megawatts surplus. But I think I don't know any other way to do that unless you can include the capacity accreditation as part of your optimization model, right? And maybe in 10 years we'll have that software. I don't know, but we don't have it yet, right? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
I think we had just one more slide, which is kind of just a note on, go advance one more. What's coming next and how E3 is going to support PSE and their RA analysis. So kind of to help PSE think about, what the contribution of the resources will be as they join the RAP, or as the RAP moves forward, we're going to produce basically a forecast of how RAP would accredit different resources as kind of a next step here. So a lot of this work is kind of predicated on forecasting, what is the regional resource mix in 2030, 35, and 2045? And with that regional resource mix, how would RAP accredit different resources just based off of what the portfolio ELCCs, how the resources in the region interact with each other. So that's kind of what's next for us, something to look forward to digging into. Yep, but I think that was all we had to share today.
Great, thank you. Questions from advisory group members? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Okay. Okay, not seeing anything. Why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide? And we can go ahead and move into the next part of the conversation with Elizabeth, incorporating the resource adequacy study. So if we'd like to have Elizabeth come on, I guess I'm not seeing her pop up. Oh, there you are.
Here,
Okay,
can you see me?
Yes, I can see you now. Sorry, I think I just had not too many windows, not enough screens. But yes, Elizabeth, over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to do a couple slides walking through how we're going to be incorporating the resource adequacy study into our analysis and kind of an overview of our portfolio modeling process as well. I think next slide. So as what Michaela went through, E3 will be providing us with the planning reserve margin and the ELCCs of all the resources along with their saturation curves. We're going to take all this information, group everything together, making sure resources are getting saturated as they move in time. So part of the process as it's going to be optimizing is it'll dynamically look through these different resources and adding new resources, how many resources have been added of the different types, and how far along the saturation it's going to be coming along. And this will all be across the different resources and across the different regions that we'll be modeling within the portfolio models. So we'll get a lot of the interactive with, seeing the batteries and the wind and the solar and how those can come together as part of the portfolio as well. I think next slide. Overall, what we're doing with the electric modeling process is our portfolio model is set up as a linear programming model. And what we're trying to optimize to is finding the portfolio that meets all of the constraints for the lowest cost. So we're trying to optimize to minimize the total portfolio cost, but we're given the constraints that we need to meet the clean energy requirements. We have to make sure we're meeting hourly loads. So this is the hourly demands out 20 years of the portfolio. And we also have to meet the peak requirements. This is where the planning reserve margin is coming in, to making sure we're meeting the peak plus the planning margin, and then accounting for all the characteristics of these resources together. So how these resources can operate, how they'll meet the renewable requirements, how they're going to meet our planning requirements for the planning margin. That'll be the ELCCs coming in, along with all of the build and transmission constraints that will be going in. So these are all the transmission zones that will be populating out and the constraints within those zones to get all the resources back to PSE. So those are all the constraints we'll be optimizing against to make sure that we hit these constraints, that the portfolio we're trying to produce is kind of the lowest cost optimal portfolio within these constraints. And on the left-hand side, I kind of categorize some of the information inputs that we are going to be putting into the portfolio model. We've kind of gone through most of the inputs at this point, and just noting that today's topic was on that kind of second item down, the PRM and ELCC. So all that will be loaded into the model as well, along with all the other information that we will be going through, and have some of the information gone through with the RPAG to this point as well. And I think next slide. So overall, what I'm trying to do is just an example of how these ELCCs will work for the different resources. So when we put this into the model, we're telling it that there is a deficit. And so we put in the planning reserve margin, we stack up all the resources, how they can meet our peak plus the planning reserve margin. And based off of all that, we're categorizing out there's a deficit. That means there's not enough resources to meet the needs or the requirements. And so what it'll do is start adding resources to making sure we're meeting these requirements. And so I'm just trying to show this as an example of how these different types of resources will meet requirements differently. And so, for example, this one is looking at the peak requirement. So if we're looking at a deficit of 2,345 megawatts, if you had a resource that had a 95% ELCC, that means that you would need about 2,400 megawatt nameplate of that resource to meet that 2,300 megawatt deficit. So that is the most efficient ELCC that you can get. That's a firm dispatchable resource to make sure it is there and available. Whereas if you're having a resource that's pretty heavily saturated already, you're going to need more of those resources to meet the exact same deficit. So for this example, I went through the saturation curves of just the 4-hour batteries that Michaela went through, and showing through this example to meet the exact same deficit. Instead of the 2,400 megawatts like we saw, now this will be about 22,000 megawatts nameplates of these 4-hour batteries to meet that exact same deficit given the saturation curves. So all of this we pulled into consideration when trying to build out that portfolio, not only meeting CEDAR requirements, but also making sure we're meeting the capacity requirements as well, with all the saturations and interactions with the resources in the portfolio as we're optimizing as well. This is my last slide, so I could stop if there's questions.
No questions I'm seeing so far, Elizabeth.
All right. I think that's it for me. I don't know if you want to take it over, Annie.
Oh, sorry, this was your last slide.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Okay, well then why don't we ask folks if they do have any last questions before we move, because I know this is the last substantive segment of our meeting today. Any questions from RPAG members? Okay, not seeing any. I think that we can just thank our presenters. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Michaela. And we can start moving into wrap up. Okay. So we've got a few things to cover. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. And thank you to all the presenters today. So moving into the next steps for today, you can go to the next slide, we'll start talking about next steps and we'll move into the public comment. So while I go through these feedback process slides and some other next steps, if you're an attendee or an observer today, why don't you go ahead and raise your hand. Ben's going to allow you to raise your hand. And that way we know to go ahead and elevate you to a panelist. You'll just have to accept that and you can come be a panelist so that we can make sure to share your video. If you'd prefer not to share your video, we can just unmute you when you want to provide public comment. So while that's happening in the back end, I'm going to cover a couple slides here. So this feedback process slide is really to help provide some clarity on how all of your feedback is tracked and used in this process. So as we've seen this before, PSE's introduced this visual a couple times at meetings so far, but we haven't had one since July. So we thought it'd be helpful to reiterate the process. It just outlines the full feedback flow. So how input from the RPAG, the Equity Advisory Group, and the public is gathered before, during, and after each of these meetings, and then whether it's shared in discussion or submitted in writing. All input is reviewed, summarized, and used to inform planning decisions, including the development of the plan that we've been, of course, talking about and is the subject of all these meetings. So we hope that this visual helps inform folks on how that looks through the process and try to just make this as transparent as possible. Really takes you through 1 week before, a few days before, day of meeting, 1 week after, and 4 weeks after those meetings. All right, next slide. This slide is new. Just I know some folks have not necessarily seen the content on the PSE slide or on the PSE website for the RPAG, and wanted to just highlight that if you go to the PSE website, you can just scroll down and each of these nice little icons you can click into, and it gives you the recording and the meeting materials for each meeting. So if you ever miss a meeting or had to leave early, as long as you give us a little bit of time, that recording and those materials will be posted. Okay, next slide. Okay, so coming up, we've got the feedback form from this meeting. The deadline to provide that feedback is October 7th. And then we have our next RPAG meeting on October 28th. Again, I think it's in the afternoon, starting at 1. Then the next RPAG meeting, I believe is, we have it here for November 13th. Okay, so because I had something different in my notes. I'll double check that, but we do have it here for November 13th, so I'm sure that's what it is. And then December, we don't have a RPAG meeting, just to try to give you some time off for the holidays. And then we are planning to have some public webinars, a lunchtime one and an evening one, both lasting about an hour, sometime in the November timeframe, likely before the holidays start. Next slide. So if anything comes up between now and that next meeting, please go ahead and email questions, feedback. If you need clarification, go ahead and email PSE at that email address. You can use the feedback form link. We can link that into the chat. You can leave a voicemail at this 425 number. You can also subscribe to the email list or visit the website that we've been referencing quite a few times today. All right, so now I'm going to check in with Ben to see if there are any commenters that are going to be providing comments today.
I don't see anyone with their hands up.
Okay. So anyone as an attendee, if you do want to provide comment, please go ahead and put your hand up. If not, that's okay. Not seeing any hands go up. We've given that a few minutes. I think we'll probably be good into wrapping up. So before we wrap up for today, we're not going to be doing any public comments. It's 3:14. No one is going to be wanting to provide that today. So we'll go ahead and wrap up, but just wanted to provide one last opportunity for questions from the RPAG members. Okay. Great. Okay. Then want to just thank you again all for being here, presenters for your time and energy it took to prepare for these presentations. It's not a light effort. And then all of you, RPAG members, for your thoughtful input. We will be following up with meeting materials. Please take a moment to complete the short Zoom poll after you exit today's meeting. It's just 3 questions, but it's super helpful on shaping the next meeting. And then we'll look forward to seeing you in the October meeting, and hopefully you're enjoying this transition of fall time in your area. Thanks, everyone. Take care.